Thank you so much, and thank you very much indeed for the opportunity of speaking to you today. I'm going to share a few slides with you. So I'll just give that a second to come up. I think that should be us up and running. Just to echo Fiona's words that it is appropriate we're talking about pandemics today, over 100 years since the Great War that took place on planet Earth, this small place that we call home. And Fiona talked a little bit about the number of people that died during the war, but double the number died in the influenza pandemic that then followed it. And I think going back through time, we have to remember that disease is the great killer. If you think of the bubonic plague Black Death that ravaged Europe for, let's be honest, well over 400 years. That took about 50% of the population of Europe and probably a lot more besides. And just to turn to the pandemic of today and looking at the data that we have available to us, it's worthwhile remembering that in North America alone, with its advanced medical technologies, something in the order of 4 times the number of people who died during the Americans who died during the Vietnam War have died. It's the equivalent to 3 jumbo jets going down every day, or the 9/11 atrocity occurring on 66 consecutive days. So the scale of death, even in this relatively short pandemic that we have been facing recently, is enormous. And we should never forget that. They're not short-lived, and they have huge impacts on society. I'm going to, rather than start with some factual accounts by others, I want to turn to a piece of foresighting that was done by the American Veterinary Medical Association, the Association of American Veterinary Medical Colleges, and the Canadian Veterinary Medical Association back in 2005. And they were foresighting what the future would look like for veterinary medical education. That's a by the by. This is 2005, and at the end of the piece of work, they generated 10 vignettes. And these vignettes were visions of the future. And I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt from one of them. And this one is called The Doomsday, the Pandemic Disaster of 2015 to 2025. Bear in mind, we are now right in the middle of that period, something that was written 15 years ago. Keith Smith had just returned from his 17th vaccination for a zoonotic-based disease in as many years. After the great scare of mad cow disease, or BSE, there had been the chicken hemorrhagic fever disease, swine influenza, avian flu, raccoon fever, and many others, including Ebola. Each new wave brought a more frightening array of symptoms and a growing risk of mortality, and further weakened the public health system. Public confidence in the government's ability to deal with these crises was at an all-time low. Many of these pathogens were unknown previously in the country, but became widespread with the increasing temperatures and the growing frequency of the extreme weather events such as hurricanes and flooding. The increasing number of pandemics was an unfortunate side effect of climate change. The war against terrorism of some 20 years ago was long forgotten. The new enemy was invisible, microscopic, and viral. Over the last 2 decades, 1/5 of the global population had perished, and the overwhelming majority of these illnesses came from animals. The times were eerily reminiscent of the Great Plague in 13th century Europe. As I say, written 15 years ago, and really could not have been more foresightful if it had tried. Now, I recognize in the very short time I have with you that perhaps when we talk about pandemics, we think about the disease impact on humans. And this is a picture taken by the construction company of the Nightingale facility in the United Kingdom, this one I believe in Manchester, in preparation for the wave of critical care beds that were anticipated in the first wave of the COVID pandemic in the United Kingdom. And I'll come back to this picture towards the end. But rather than thinking just about the disease implications, Heather's already touched upon some of the other aspects. And this is a illustration from many years ago, which talks of rinderpest. And rinderpest was only the second disease to be eradicated from the planet, the first being smallpox. The rinderpest was cattle plague. And whilst it wouldn't have any direct impact in terms of the infection of humans, of course, the supply of protein and the disruption to food chain was massive, as any pandemic would be, even if it did not affect clinically by infection humans. So that got me thinking a little bit. If we're thinking about where we're going with the control of pandemics, what are the factors that we need to consider? And we can't look at just humans or just animals. In fact, if we then start to think about the risks that are brought about by the way in which we live our lives, and again, Heather has touched on some, I would encourage you to spend some time reflecting on one of the links that I put in the blog that accompanies this webinar series. And if you take the world as we know it today and we overlay it with population growth, if we overlay it with where there is poverty, if we overlay it with where we expect there to be the need for protein and animal protein to support that human population growth, not just the protein, but the micronutrients that accompany products of animal origin. And if you overlay on that the paucity of human healthcare services, and overlay on that the paucity of veterinary healthcare services, and perhaps even overlay on that where we're likely to see incursions into habitats in which we have not previously held dominion. And if you overlay on that perhaps where we would see most vector-borne diseases, you've almost got the perfect storm. In fact, you have got the perfect storm. And that human expansion of the human population and the need for it to feed itself will ultimately prove to be one of the major risks for pandemics. Now, classically, when we talk about One Health, and I realize that the previous webinar in the series spoke a little bit in more general terms about One Health, this triumvirate is really what underpins most teaching of most infectious disease in medical schools, veterinary schools, and wherever else. And it's this bringing together the host, the pathogen, and environment that brings you to a point where perhaps at the intercept of this Venn diagram, in the middle of the three circles overlapping, that one would expect One Health to be most manifest. And of course, that's correct. An important addition I've put to this one, it usually says host, pathogen, environment. I think for the purposes of this morning, we really ought to be looking at hosts, pathogen, and environment, so hosts in the plural. But for me, there are issues around just regarding this as a kind of single or rather two-dimensional diagram. We have to consider how we bring these together in a way that addresses a One Health solution, as may have been described perhaps most effectively by the FAO, I think in their aquaculture program. And here they take the concepts that perhaps Schwabe is best known for promulgating his Cattle Priests and Progress in Medicine, or Veterinary Medicine and Human Health. In those two texts, he outlined, I think, what has been the basis of our One Medicine or One Health. But I think taking the approach that we have today to the next level requires us to be a bit more strategic. And so this something, at least the three levels drawn from thinking and promulgated by the FAO, as I say, speaks to me of what a One Health solution can look like. And if we take that Venn diagram of the previous slide, where we've got hosts, pathogen, and environment, and then we consider three different levels. So in order to affect a One Health solution, in order to prevent, in order to manage a pandemic, you need a technical level solution. And just in these last few days, we've heard that we may have at least a contribution to that technical level solution in the vaccine. For other diseases, it might be we need an appropriate antibiotic, or we need to have bed nets that work in terms of protecting people from mosquito bites, or condoms that work. So in terms of controlling a disease, we need a technical level solution. But that's not enough. We also need the societal level solution, and that is that people behave appropriately. So if there is a vaccine available, it is not going to be the exit strategy if only 40 or 50% of the population use it. And finally, we need the institutional level. We need legislation, and we need intergovernmental support, and we need funding to make a One Health solution a reality. And it's only when these three come together that we can truly say that we're addressing things in a One Health fashion. And if any of you are familiar with my PowerPoint skills, you'll know that it took me an awful long time to make that slide, and I'm just going to let you enjoy it again. It's available for a small fee. So what of the One Health Poultry Hub? Well, my concerns are not my concerns, but the reality is that the poultry are going to be the backbone of that expansion of protein. And as I said, it's not just disruption of the protein supply chain, it's also the fact that there may be zoonotic diseases that animals and humans share that also play into that. And I don't think anybody would doubt that the one disease that we thought we would be facing at the next pandemic is not this coronavirus, but actually influenza. And of course, influenza is a viral infection, which does affect poultry populations. So I hope we will have time to talk about some of the drivers for this, but what I'd like to do is just in closing, speak a little bit about lessons learned. This is from the TB pandemic, one might argue, but dates back to 1889, and I draw you to the second paragraph. It is suggested by high authorities that possibly a number of human maladies may be traceable to animals and that the public would be best protected by conjoint action on the part of experts from the two branches of medical practice. The two branches of medical practice, that's human medicine and veterinary medicine. And secondly, I showed you the Nightingale Hospital at the start of my presentation. This isn't a Nightingale Hospital. This is a hospital from the pandemic that took place in 1918. This one, of course, is monochrome, but the similarities are remarkable. And most finally of all, you know, they knew how to do it back then. Why can we not get this through to the population today? Thank you.